Who do I have in front of me at all?
Des Murnane from Tipperary Town.
And Des, you've published a fairly sizable publication on the Civil War in County Tipperary.
Well, it began with the War of Independence. We did a book done by the County Council which mainly focuses on the 3rd Brigade. Tipperary was divided into 3 brigades. The one in the south was the 3rd, the one in the north was the 1st, the one in the middle was the 2nd. But the one in the south, the 3rd, was the one that everybody knows about and was the most important and the most active. So the book I did was mainly concentrating on what they did during the War of Independence. That was 2018. And then last year we did another book, this time on the Civil War. Again, it could be said too many pages, because between the two together it's over 1,000 pages, which is more than has been published with regard to any other county that I'm aware of. But then an awful lot happened in Tipperary, but not in Tipperary County as such, you've to kind of be more specific. In both the War of Independence and the Civil War, a lot of the activities in the south and in the Midwest. One of the ways, I was giving a talk before, and one of the ways I tried to explain the differentiation within the county, which is very important. Obviously, if you're looking at the county from outside, Tipperary is Tipperary is Tipperary, but if you're looking at it from within, it isn't. And one of the ways I tried to explain that was, if you could imagine 4 adult siblings, and during the period we're talking about, like the War of Independence and Civil War, and we'll say one was living in Tipperary Town, one was living in Thurles, one was living in Cahir, and one was living in Roscrea. And they were living in those towns for the duration of the activity. Well, they had 4 totally different experiences. The person who was in Cahir had a fairly easy time, because Cahir is an estate town, and as somebody once correctly said, hardly a pane of glass was broken. If they were living in Tipperary, it was directly the opposite, and the 2 towns are quite close to each other. Tipperary was immensely damaged in both wars. In the Civil War, it's the only town really in the county that the Republicans tried to hold on when the Free State was moving in. So the amount of damage, in fact, one of the ironies is that Tipperary town was the most active, probably for a town of its size, one of the most active in the country. It was also one of the most damaged. And the irony is, given its activity during the War of Independence and Civil War, it was much more prosperous under the British than it was in independence, which is something that in today's Tipperary town people are aware of, and there is a certain amount of agitation about it. Anyway, that's Cahir and Tipperary. So in Thurles, the experience then was totally different, because it was the one town that the Republicans never managed to get hold of, and it was entirely in the hands of the Free State, even though the Republicans were kind of circling it, and the people who were in Thurles, which of course was the seat of the Archbishop and so on, were constantly expecting that the Republicans would pour in on top of them, but it didn't happen, so it remained in Free State hands. But there was a lot of activity during that time, and particularly during the War of Independence. The black and tan murder gangs were particularly active in Thurles, so not a very comfortable town to be living in during the period. And then you come to a town like Roscrea, where again it would have been more like Cahir, not a lot happened. So it's just a way of explaining you had very, very different experiences depending where you were living. I mentioned there were 3 brigades, and again it depended, in which brigade area were you living. If you were very politically minded and inclined towards the Republican ideology, well, you would have been very comfortable in the south, where the 3rd Brigade of the 3 brigades was the most active. The brigades were organised in battalions, because while the IRA had huge difficulty getting access to arms, they did take themselves very seriously as a military force. So in terms of their organisation, companies and battalions, in brigades, and then early in 1921 they decided they would do the next level and organise into divisions, which probably wasn't a great idea, because they didn't have, at the end of the day, they're the volunteers with a capital V, but they're also the volunteers with a small v. And so the IRA was nothing if not very local. And one of the ideas they had with having the divisions was because a division would have several brigades. So again, it's kind of, you had the first division, which was down in the very south of the country now. Then the second division was this area, and then the third division was North Tipperary up into the Midlands. So we were in the second division here, and you had two brigades in Limerick. You had two brigades in Tipperary of the three, and you had the Kilkenny brigade. Kilkenny was just one brigade. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 brigades. But of those 5, the person put in charge was Ernie O'Malley. But he was in no doubt that of the 5 brigades, the one that mattered and the one that he relied on was the 3rd Tipperary. And the theory behind the brigades, of course, was that where you had some areas that weren't pulling their weight and weren't particularly active, that the men from the more active brigades would move in. Fine on paper and in theory. But the IRA is very local. Its membership is very local, and identities are very local. I mean, even within a county, never mind having Limerick men coming into Tipperary or Tipperary. I mean, it really was never going to work in practical terms. And again, in theory, if you were in a brigade, you were not supposed to have contact with GHQ in Dublin except through the divisional. Again, that was never a good idea because people, whoever was in charge of the various brigades at that level, needed to feel during the War of Independence when there was a unified command. So they had, but I think the reason was, as it's early in 1921, that they were an army and they had to be taken seriously. And armies, at the end of the day, if you have enough men, they're divided into divisions. At the moment, I suppose the focus is on the Civil War. We're kind of coming into that centenary, having been through all the others. That's the difficult one, of course, because nobody was ever going to dispute the argument that the Black and Tans were bad guys, and that anybody who fought the Black and Tans or who were on the receiving end were likely to be the good guys. So it's very, in narrative terms, it was very straightforward. As I said, I wrote a book on the Civil War in the county, but the focus is obviously south of the county where most of the activity. And if you look at the 3 brigades, which again Tipperary was divided into, the one in the north was in a different division, and the focus there was towards Laois and Offaly, and they went Free State. The Republican element did launch themselves into a kind of a guerrilla warfare, and they launched ambushes and so on, but effectively, and you had very much a divided command because some went one way and some went the other way, and some just stood on the sidelines and didn't go any way. And similarly in the south of the county, which was in the 2nd division, which was the 2nd brigade and the 3rd brigade, mid-Tipperary, South Tipperary were together. But again, all the running was made by the south because the chap who was in charge of the mid-Tipperary was Jim Leahy from Thurles. And he was very active and very famous during the War of Independence. He worked they had a family, I think, had a pub in the square in Thurles. But during the Civil War, much less so, and he kind of got into trouble with the more hardline Republicans in that they failed. Templemore is not very far from Thurles, and Templemore obviously has a huge military complex, the Garda Training College now. So they wanted that either captured or burned, preferably, I suppose, burned, and Leahy is the man who was in charge, and again, it's a complicated story, but to give the short version, it wasn't burned, for which he got a lot of stick. But of course, the way I look at it today, if you were to ask anybody in Templemore, well, would you have preferred your barracks to have been burned? I think they would have probably said no. So in that respect, time changes perspective. So in those 2 brigades, there was a lot of division of opinion. Some leaders went one way, some went the other way. 3rd Tipperary Brigade, totally different. The leadership there was rock solid, anti-treaty. The treaty, the date most people will know, signed on the 6th of December. By the 10th, O'Malley and Lynch, who's leading the 1st Division, Cork, Kerry, those areas, they're against the treaty. In other words, there's clearly no meetings of men to discuss the ins and outs of the treaty and will we or won't we. There's an edict from on high. And so vehement was the 3rd Brigade in its opposition to the treaty that some of the people, the leaders in the 3rd Brigade, wanted the delegates, when they came back from London having signed, to be arrested for treachery. Cathal Brugha, who was technically in charge of the army, Collins, of course, might have had a different view. It's one of the reasons why they loathed each other. He thought maybe that was a push too far. But it's an indication of the kind of certainty and the vehemence that there was in the south. And even the political representation in South Tipperary. The TD from the 1918 election for the Tipperary town area, which was the most Republican area, was P.J. Maloney, who in his private professional life was a pharmacist in Tipperary. But his sons were very active in the War of Independence, and one of them subsequently in the Civil War. He was kind of number 2 nationally in the anti-treaty side. But another son was killed towards the end of the War of Independence, which is 1921, and the treaty is 1921. And I've always understood, I mean, when it came to the vote on the treaty, P.J. Maloney, the TD, obviously voted against the treaty. Now, that I absolutely understand, because only months before, his son had been killed with a man from Monaghan, Jim Duffy. They'd actually been betrayed, but that's a kind of another. So it made the killing of them kind of all the worse, because, again, I'm kind of going off into tangents a little, but that they'd had a suspected spy whom they had wanted to execute, which was not that unusual. And they'd get permission from on high, and on high said, no, there isn't enough evidence, and they let him go. And clearly they probably should have executed him, because they were out at their home place and they would have been paying very periodic visits, and lo and behold, soldiers and the TANs and the police were there, and the 2 of them were killed. But my point is, that was only a few months before the vote. Now, that Maloney chap, Paddy Maloney, didn't die for Home Rule. He didn't die for Dominion status. What he died for was the Republic. And it's always intriguing if you be semantically correct about it. It's never a republic, which, you know, politically kind of is what we're talking about. It's just a form of government. It's the republic, which kind of elevates it to something kind of sacred. And so there's no way that somebody like P.J. Maloney, you know, could have. So I absolutely understand that. It's much more difficult to understand the absolute denial of any kind of democracy, because if you look at all the institutions within the county, whether it's town governments, whether it's because there are 2 county councils in the north and the south, whether it's Sinn Féin clubs, whether it's Board of Guardians, any kind of collective body, they all, after the vote on the treaty in the Dáil, so we're talking kind of into January 1922, with virtually no exception, and they all supported the treaty. The 3 main newspapers in Tipperary, the Nina Guardian for the north, the Tipperary Star kind of for mid, the Nationalist for the south, they were all, of course, in favour of the treaty. So any kind of, and of course the church, well, when I say the church, the institutional church, but you did have individual priests, famously in Tipperary, a priest called Matt Ryan, known as the General from his activity during the Land War. He was a parish priest in Dundrum. But he was a kind of a maverick. So you did have individual, but on the whole, the church, certainly institutionally, and even somebody in North Tipperary, the bishop there had been very supportive of Sinn Féin, but he was pro-treaty. So whatever way you want to look, the people wanted the treaty. And that's the problem then, of course, that the people didn't have the guns. So it didn't really matter whatever division of opinion there was between politicians. It was the IRA. So the crucial issue was, how are they going to go? But in South Tipperary, in the 3rd Brigade, where it mattered, and the 3rd Brigade was divided into 8 battalions covering South Tipperary, The 4th Battalion was the largest, the one that had the most recognised leaders, was the most important, and that's Tiptown and District. And of course, there was never any, Tracy and Breen and all these people associated with Lacey. There was never any doubt, not even for a moment. And as I said, there was no question of, calling the companies. In the Tiptown company, well, there were 2 companies. There would have been maybe 250 men. That's before the Fusiliers, the people who rushed to join, to share in the glory once the truce came. But the genuine members who had fought during the War of Independence. So there was no question, which there could have been, because on the 11th of July 1921, the truce came, so there was no longer any fear if you were having a meeting that you'd be raided by the police or the Black and Tans or the military, because Tiptown, of course, had a military barracks as well as everything else. So there easily, there could have, if there were any kind of democratic instincts. But then the crucial thing to understand about that is that the people in the IRA, the leadership of the IRA, had contempt for politics. It isn't like that, I'm putting it quite strongly. There's a wonderful story about one of the IRA leaders, and he explains this in his Bureau of Military History witness statement, which would have dated then probably from the 50s, that during the election campaign in 1918, the sitting MP, who had been an MP for years and years, was a guy called Tom Condon from Clonmel. He had butcher's business here in Clonmel. And he foolishly perhaps ran again. And he was speaking at a political meeting for the in Ardfinnan. And so, they had a platform, and he was up on that platform. And this IRA guy who was telling this with pride in the 50s, said he was passing with some of his men, and he saw this, and he stopped whatever he was driving, got out, went up to the platform, and told your man that he was a traitor to his country and that he wasn't going to be allowed to speak, and ended the political meeting. But that was told with absolute pride. So there was contempt. And there are stories which are apocryphal because, of course, you're never going to get evidence, vote early and vote often in the 1918 election. Now, there isn't any doubt but that Sinn Féin would have won, because the virtue that Sinn Féin had was, of course, they were not running on their record. The Home Rule Party, the Parliamentary Party were running on their record, which in many respects was very positive. Labourers' cottages, reform of local government, education, lots of things had been done, but of course they had failed in the big thing, bringing any kind of home rule or any kind of self-government. So they had a record, but the other people, the Sinn Féin people, as some of them subsequently admitted, vote for the Republic, but they never explained what exactly, where exactly, how exactly. But as I said, it's easier to put a record or a promise, and it's easier to run on a promise. So they would have won anyway, but there was a lot. But coming back to the lead into the Civil War, the IRA was, and its leadership was totally contemptuous of politics and politicians. And that has to be put very strongly. It isn't even the case that, they were a bit, even though some of the IRA people were, themselves TDs, but Collins, sometimes you see him in his civvies, and sometimes you see him in his military uniform, but of course once the Civil War begins, he's mainly in his military uniform. The same with Mulcahy, a lot of these people. It's the military thing that matters. So they kind of had to play the political game. And on that pro-treaty side, of course, there was growing tension as you went through the Civil War between the people who had a military background and the people who didn't. People like Hogan and O'Higgins and Cosgrave. They might have been out in 1916, but essentially they were politicians. And they wanted the war over and done with. And they were pushing for the executions. And, a much more vigorous, Hernán de Blyde again would have been another. They were much more, they didn't have the kind of sentimental, because the thing for the IRA in the Civil War, for the long timers, the old stagers, they were fighting against people who had been their colleagues in the War of Independence. The most famous example of that, I suppose, is again, it's nothing to do with Tipperary. Owen MacNeill, who was the man who kind of rescinded 1916, was the leader of the volunteers, kind of a leading figure. Well, when the Civil War came, he was obviously on the pro-treaty side, but one of his sons was killed fighting for the Republican side. But that's a very one of the episodes during the truce period here in Tipperary was the RIC barracks at Anacarthy, which is a village in South Tipperary, absolute fortress of a place. So there's a question which of the IRAs was going to get hold of it. And a chap called Carew, who was one of the exceptions in the South who went pro-treaty, so he sent his men in to get hold of it. And then the IRAs, the anti-treaty people, sent their men in, led by Lacey. But my point is, Lacey on the Republican side, Carew on the treaty side, first cousins. And Carew was wounded, and there's a wonderful story. He was taken to the military hospital in Tipperary. One of the first people to visit him was Lacey. But I mean that's the kind of thing replicated, obviously, all over the country. I mentioned about the truce. It's always interested me that, I mean, obviously a lot of books have been published about the Civil War in the last year or so. Not least, of course, the Cork University Press. They have a mammoth book, not just the Civil War, that whole War of Independence period. But none of the books really give much attention to the truce period. I suppose if you're writing a book, you kind of want to get into the bang-bang bit and the fighting, because the truce theoretically is this period between the War of Independence and the Civil War, when kind of, quote-unquote, nothing happens. Now, the book I did on the Civil War absolutely doesn't follow that, because loads happened, particularly in South Tipperary, and several people were killed. One of the most notorious examples relates to Thurles. One of the things that happened after the truce was the people who had been locked up. One of the things the British did towards the end of the War of Independence, they introduced internment, and because they didn't have to go through the process, so they caught you and just locked you up. And the internment camp was Ballykindler up in the north. So with the truce, a lot of those men were released. And so they were going home by train. And obviously the main Dublin-Cork line is Thurles. And if you know Thurles, there's a railway bridge. And one of the policemen in Thurles, a guy called Furlong, couldn't cope with the change and these guys coming back. So he dropped a bomb on the train. Crazy stuff. And was killed. No, sorry. One of the internees returning home was killed. But of course, a week or two later, he was at a coursing meeting or a greyhound meeting somewhere, maybe Kilmallock or somewhere, and the IRA killed him. But that's kind of during the truce. In Tipperary town, there was a member of the Black and Tans who probably had stepped on a lot of toes during the war. So kind of payback time. And he was in one of the pubs just on his own having a drink, and guys went in and tried to kill him. Now he was wounded, but it always makes me think when you have examples, and there are several examples of that, where people are shooting at close quarters and somebody's not killed. There were two problems with the IRA in that respect. They had bad weapons in many cases. I mean, they weren't properly maintained and they didn't function as they should. And of course, they didn't have that much practice because you couldn't be wasting ammunition. So it's not a surprise that in those. So anyway, this chap managed to survive. The two most famous breaks of because when the truce came, the British side and the Irish side negotiated terms. What was to happen and what wasn't to happen. And the IRA were allowed to have training camps, which they did have, because they were now preparing for. Well, the theory was that the truce could break down, because all the truce is, okay, we're not surrendering, we're just going to stop fighting to see if we can start talking. There's always the possibility we won't be able to start talking, so we'll have to start fighting again. So training camps were set up, mainly in kind of abandoned big houses, or houses that the RA caused to be abandoned, which was probably more likely. Training on things like weapons and making bombs and so on. So, and it also was important to keep IRA members active. And as I said, you had a lot of these people who were now joining the IRA, these Truciliers who had no notion and no discipline. So during that period, that preparation, as I say, in the minds of the leadership of the IRA was very much for the renewal of the War of Independence, which is what the hardliners actually wanted, because then whatever divisions that there were, the two sides would come back together, particularly in relation to Northern Ireland. One of the problems, again, slight detour, one of the problems with the Republican position with regard to the treaty, again, at least this is my understanding of it, is, I mean, okay, the anti-treaty side is the Republican side. But in Irish history, I mean, it's not as if republicanism has been a thing in Ireland forever. It's a creation of the 18th century, of three things, of the Enlightenment, of the American Revolution, of the French Revolution, and these ideas came in. So it hasn't been there forever. But insofar as that idea is in Ireland, it relates to 32 counties. It has never related to anything else. So if you're talking about a Republican position, it's 32 counties. But the problem is with the Government of Ireland Act, that 6 of those counties had been carved up, and there was already a government functioning and Stormont and so on. So if you were going to have a republic, you had an issue with regard to, well, how much of the island, and what do you mean by a republic, or will you settle for something less? I mean, you know, that was the issue when you went to the negotiations. But if you're adopting a doctrinaire republican position, it's 32 counties, and it's a republic, which means the king isn't still involved. I mean, you cut your ties completely. So as far as the IRA leadership in South Tipperary was concerned, you know, who were absolutely kind of absolutist about it, what they were preparing for was a renewal of the War of Independence. But that really wasn't going to work unless they could bring the entire IRA with them. And that was the problem. You had particularly a lot of the GHQ, the people in Dublin, most famously, I suppose, Collins and Mulcahy, who of course has a Tipperary connection. Mulcahy, his father was a post office worker and so moved around. So a lot of Richard Mulcahy's early education would have been in Thurles. And he's actually buried outside Thurles. So he has strong Tipperary connections. So as far as they were concerned, you know, that ship had sailed, and the treaty was the best deal that could be got. Collins's famous line turned out to be correct, you know, that it's not the ultimate, and it's kind of, we can make more of it. It's the freedom to achieve freedom. And so eventually the ties were broken with Britain and we became a republic. But on the other issue, we're still 26 counties last time I looked. Because, you know, they're two separate. When the people went to London to negotiate, you had the issue of how many counties and you had the issue of the relationship with Britain, kind of two issues. So they went looking for a 32-county republic. They came back with a 26-county dominion. So they had to give on both of those, which I suspect is why De Valera didn't go. Because, again, my understanding, because that's one of the kind of imponderables of that period. You know, why didn't De Valera go with the team? And De Valera parsed that for the rest of his life. I mean, he was very conscious of his own historical, how history would see him. And he had all kinds of views, as, you know, that he'd be a line of defence and that they would be able to come back and he wouldn't be there and he wouldn't be under pressure. But he must have known, again, it's how I look at it, in any negotiation, I mean, just look at the word, suggests you're going to look for X, but you'll settle for X minus. I mean, otherwise there isn't a negotiation. So the ultimate position from the Irish delegates was 32 county republic. Okay, we're not going to get it. So how many of the 32 counties can we get, and what's the best relationship we're going to get on the republic side? We're not going to get the republic, so we'll get dominion status, which was quite a lot. Again, it's how I look at it. I'm Tipperary town, and there was a military barracks in Tipperary and a big RIC presence. And if I think back to, pick a year, 1910. And if somebody was to say to, you know, even to the men who were going to be active a decade later, because they were all very young, and at that stage, you know, they might have been in their early teens, and if somebody had said to them in 1910, you know, not just within your lifetime, but within a decade, there'll be no soldiers in the barracks, and there'll be no RIC in the police barracks. It would seem absolutely unbelievable and fantastic, because in the military barracks, you always had one battalion of a particular British regiment, so that'd be 700-800 men, and that had been the case as back to the 1870s, and it was an important RIC station, and of course people all understand the semantics of it. In Ireland, we don't have police stations; we have police barracks, having to do with, of course, their kind of militarised situation. And the other thing with the RIC, which always intrigues me, is that in terms of their background, they're precisely and exactly the same as the IRA. Exact same kind of background, kind of men who otherwise would be shop assistants, would be farm labourers, small farmer sons, which again made the whole tension between them the more terrible. And particularly when there is a tendency on our part to think that the worst of the policing was black and tans, and the black and tans were English. That's kind of the popular perception, which makes it easier because it's us and them. But of course that isn't accurate. A lot of the black and tans were Irish and joined up for, it was a career at a time when people didn't have jobs. But it made the killing between them and the tension and the fire all the more terrible, because they are the same people. And the sense of betrayal. I mean, again, I'm talking about Tipperary town, where everything was at its most intense. Anywhere else in the county and anywhere else in the country, the day came when the police withdrew, just as the military withdrew. I mean, famously here in Clonmel, the crowds cheered and they marched out, and somebody from the IRA marched in. In Tipperary, of course, that didn't happen with the police. The police had evacuated the barracks with their equipment and everything, and then the day came when this is March 1922, the day came when the last of them were to leave. And so they were going to, a lot of them had used Limerick Junction, to go by train. But the last of them were leaving in lorries, because they were taking the last of their equipment and so on. And so they left the barracks in the town and they went down a street to get onto the Dublin road, because they were going to drive to Dublin. And you think, well, fine, they're leaving. And so we'll either ignore them, or we'll give them the finger, or we'll do whatever. But because it's Tipperary, of course, there's an ambush on the street. And there's hell for leather, and bombs are thrown, and of course the petrol and some of the vehicles. And at least two are killed. But it subsequently becomes more complicated, because Churchill, who's the minister responsible for this stuff in Ireland, is asked in the House of Commons about this. And of course it turns out that the local leader of the IRA knew that as was the final withdrawal of the police, they would have had money and they would have had weapons. And that's what the ambush was about. And of course there was betrayal by some of the black and tans who are now losing their jobs, were going to be disbanded and had nothing to lose, and so would have been given some money. But again, it's just, I take it as typical of the Tipperary town story, where nothing is as it is anywhere else. And you had, I think it was three killed. And it's quite pathetic afterwards when you look to the compensation records from those policemen's families, which you can do. And, the dire situation they're left in, because when it was all over, nobody really wanted to know anything about the RIC particularly. There was a kind of shuffling around it, who was responsible for pension payments and all the rest of it. So it was, and a lot of the IRA, of the RIC, even those who had retired, and in any town in the country, but particularly in Tipperary, you would have retired RIC men. Some of them would have gone other business, might have set up as shopkeepers, or some of them kind of boarding house keepers or whatever. But depending on how they had been while they had been RIC, they were forced to leave. Even though at that stage you would think they'd retired, and their families would have been part of the local community, because before all this started, like 1916, I suppose, before that, people had their reservations about the RIC. They were very officious, but they were parts of the local community. That's famously the case with the Salahid Beg ambush and the two policemen that were killed. One of them, MacDonald, is buried in Tipperary town, which of course is very telling, because they were always from somewhere else. You'd never get to serve locally. And so when they died from natural causes or were killed, they were brought back home, as was his companion. But MacDonald is buried in Tipperary town. There's a photograph in some of the books that we've done, so people can see. But he had quite a few children, and so they would have been part and parcel of the local until all this happened, and of course everything. So it's a part of the story of those years that's very easy to forget. Anybody who had kind of made common cause, or who was in the business of servicing the gentry, would now come under suspicion. I don't think it was. I'd be pretty sure it's not sectarian. In other words, it isn't that, oh, you're Protestant, you're kind of the enemy. I don't think it happened like that at all. I think it very much depended on your record of what kind of person you were, and basically, if you had a position of power and authority, how officious you were. I think that was one of the problems Irish people had with the RIC, that if some of them were very officious, the odds are it was some bastard from Kerry who was being officious. And I always think psychologically that was much more difficult to take than if it was some army guy from Yorkshire or something with, Yorkshire. Somehow it didn't make it seem as... So that would have mattered. I'm jumping around quite a lot, but I was talking about the truce. The two big incidents that nearly collapsed the truce, because as I said, there were terms and conditions agreed to allow the truce to happen. It isn't just some magic thing that they all stopped. It was agreed. And the two big things that happened, of course, were in this county. Again, no surprise. One before the treaty was signed and one after. And the one before the treaty was signed, the IRA in Tipperary town couldn't resist wanting to build up their stock of arms and weapons and explosives. And in Tipperary town, there was a military barracks, which had been built in the 1870s. But during the First World War, the numbers expanded enormously. So you went from having one unit, which might be 700 or 800 men, to 4. So you had thousands of soldiers. So they had to build a lot of ancillary accommodation, which was kind of wooden huts, known locally, now long gone, but known as the hutments. But clearly the point is much easier to break into, not surrounded by a big stone wall like the barracks. And so that was the first of the incidents that broke the truce. The IRA in Tipperary broke into the hutments and stole what weapons, so got a big haul of weapons. And of course the IRA were furious. Like, obviously the British were furious, but the IRA was also the leadership because this was a threat to the truce. And so Collins sent down one of his men to investigate, and there was a lot of kerfuffling, and the guy sent down knew what had happened but had to go through the motions, and the people here knew he knew. And then some of the leadership here was summoned up to Dublin because it was at a delicate stage in the talks in London and the talks about the talks. Then the second big thing was after the treaty, when again the treaty hadn't been agreed, the British were withdrawing, so a lot of the police and military had withdrawn into, in this case, Clonmel, and brought their weapons and equipment with them, waiting for disbandment until one evening. This is about March 1922. The IRA raided here in Clonmel. Maybe got some inside help, but got a big stock of weapons and ammunition. Again, a huge breach of the truce, and a lot of. But the truce held because it was in the political interests of the two sides for it to hold. But if one of the two sides had been looking for an excuse, if it was at that kind of a stage where we need a truce where we can say that the truce is broken down and we can clearly blame the other side, which is what would be looked for. So it was very, very dangerous. But the point is, the IRA here in South Tip didn't care because they weren't interested in the politics. They knew that that we were building towards a renewal of the war, not with the British, but within the IRA. So you needed as many guns and as much explosives as you could possibly get. So from those two raids. So my point about the ignoring the truce as a period when nothing happened, it's I don't know, maybe it's true elsewhere, but certainly it isn't true in Tipperary. A huge amount happened that was quite dangerous during the truce. And then when the war, when the civil war itself begins, the best way probably to think about it is that you have an urban phase. I'm talking here about Tipperary County. You have an urban phase, and then you have a rural phase. And the rural phase basically is a return to the past. Now, the urban phase is once the Dublin business was over, the Four Courts, I mean, that only lasted a few days. And the Free State got control of Dublin. And stupidly on their part, they let people like Robinson and Lynch get out of Dublin and go south. But again, I suppose, colleagues, and you're hoping that they will, I mean, in Lynch's case, I think he gave his word that he wouldn't cause any trouble. And, people are hoping for the best and looking for the best. But in retrospect, it was a mistake. And there is this idea then of this kind of Munster Republic, because, of course, the IRA in the south was very gung-ho in terms of opposition to the treaty. And so the idea of a line from kind of Waterford through Carrick, through Clonmel, Tipperary on up to Limerick, and that would hold. And of course it didn't. I mean, within a very short time, all of that collapsed. In Tipperary town, again talking about the Tipperary County, once the Free State moved in, which it did in the summer of 1922, I mean, the Free State, the advantage the Free State had was they had the numbers and they had the weapons, but they didn't have the training. The advantage the IRA had, of course, was they had the experienced men and the experienced leaders, the leaders that were kind of famous. But at the end of the day, as the war went on, the Free State Army became much more attuned to what was needed. Even so, their training was still very inadequate. When I did the Civil War book, I tried to itemize the casualties, the fatalities, which isn't something that has been done nationally. A book was published recently doing that nationally for the War of Independence. But it's very difficult to do because, if you have a soldier in a barracks and he kills himself, is that because he's personal reasons or is it the stress of... So it's quite a difficult thing to do. But what did strike me about the figures for County Tipperary is that more Free State were killed than Republicans. But about 20, which is a very big number, of the Free State people killed themselves. It was, there's gun accidents. Either killed themselves or shot somebody else. The most telling, kind of bleakly comic version of that is you had a Free State soldier from Dublin. I mean, they joined up for the money. It was a career. It wasn't a political thing. And he was down, I think, in New Inn, in a village in Tipperary. And his father had come down to visit him. And you can imagine the scene, the young fella showing the father the gun and shot the father dead, which is really kind of an extraordinary. There are lots of incidents, but that's the one that was kind of the most. But the number of those, is extraordinary. So the IRA had the advantage one way, the training and the experience and the leadership. But at the end of the day, the Free State could keep recruiting men, which they did. The other thing, of course, about the Free State is with their executions policy, they were more ruthless at the end of the day. Because again, my interpretation of it, you had people like Hogan and these people, very middle class, absolutely appalled at the level of destruction, kind of physical destruction in kind of railways, but particular target for the IRA. And these people on the Free State side knew they were going to have to run this country, and you had this massive amount of destruction. So they were prepared to do whatever was needed to bring it to an end. The towns in Tipperary where the Republicans controlled, once the Free State appeared, the Republicans withdrew to the hills. And as I said, you then have the rural aspect of the war, which is like the guerrilla warfare against the British, except in Tipperary town, where they held out. And on the 28th of July, this is 1922, the Free State appeared, and the fighting lasts, that's a Friday, it lasts until the Sunday morning. And again, there's a photograph in the little booklet that was done by the council. There is a monument just outside Tipperary town to 3 IRA men who were killed. But what happened is they were laying a landmine to blow up the advancing Free Staters and didn't know what they were doing and blew themselves up. And the descriptions of the blowing themselves up are absolutely appalling. I mean, they were just, all over the place. And there's a memorial to them. But my point is that while it's terrible what happened to them, you have to bear in mind also what it is they were they were doing. But that's the nature of civil war. And during that battle for Tipperary, and we're just about coming up now, at the end of the month, it will be the centenary, so we'll probably do something in Tipperary not to celebrate, but just to mark the event. And as on that Sunday morning, as the Free State got control of the town and as the Republicans withdrew, they destroyed what they could destroy. So the military barracks was burnt, the creamery, because the town depended, as it still does, that's its main source of employment. They burned the creamery. Now before that, the creamery had been taken over by the workers and had been a Soviet. And there was a kind of an easy get out, it was the workers burned. No, it was the IRA burned the creamery. There isn't any doubt about that. As they withdraw, they also destroyed water mains and destroyed bridges. I mean, a huge amount. And before that, and subsequently until the end of the Civil War, their big thing was destroying railway stock and railway bridges. And I didn't realise until I did the work, but as you go along a railway line, there are kind of things like big staples that hold down the railway line. They're actually called chairs. So an easy thing to take those up, which means that the line, the rails are no longer steady. And I always think that if you give children, if you ever watch small boys, cars to play with, or trains, or anything to play with, the biggest fun, of course, is crashing them. I mean, it's human nature. So you get these IRA chaps who are late teens, early 20s, and they're told by their superiors to go out and crash some trains. I mean, what's not to like? And that's literally what they did. A lot of the freight trains rather than passengers, but some passenger trains, having told the passengers to bugger off about their business. And I mean, there must be an element of fun if you can have control of an engine and you send it careering along the line into some of the freight wagons. And if you are on an embankment and the whole lot comes crashing down, I mean, it's as I say, it's wonderful fun, and you're doing it for real. But the level of damage that was caused was quite extraordinary. So once the Republicans had lost control of the towns, that was the next and last phase of the war, which was the most terrible phase. It was basically Mark II of the guerrilla war that had been, where you had flying columns. The difference now, of course, was that you no longer had a supportive population. Some of the people were supportive and some weren't, and difficult sometimes to know who. And the other big thing was, of course, the safe houses thing. The flying columns depended on safe houses, where they could get help and respite and put on their powder to get rid of the Republican itch and wash their socks and so on. But now, I mean, what house was going to be safe? Because, had the politics of whoever owned the house changed? But also, more to the point, if it was a house that had been used during the War of Independence, some of the people who had been with you then might be now on the other side. And there's a famous example of that in Black Castle, which is down in the south of the county, where I think 2 IRA people were, because some of these safe houses were very elaborate. I mean, they were like annexes built at the backs of barns and very carefully disguised, and had succeeded and worked during the War of Independence. But now, if they were using them during the Civil War, was bad news, because likely someone in the Free State, I know exactly. And in this instance, two of the IRA were killed. Again, in Tipperary, the most famous is of the safe places, which remained safe because it's a Civil War creation, was a place called Kathmandu, which is where De Valera and a lot of the national leadership went. For a lot of the Civil War, Lynch was in Dublin, but eventually he made his way south, and they had various meetings to decide. Clearly the war was not going their way, and they had to have some place for the leadership to meet. So one of the places they met was this house, which I don't know where the name came from, but it was called Kathmandu, probably from there was a kind of a Victorian song, The Little Yellow God, or The Eyes of Kathmandu. I think it's a music hall thing, nothing to do with Nepal as such. But it was a safe house that was safe, and it's kind of, I don't know what's left of it now, but it was historic because that's where a lot of the Republican meetings were held. Military, now De Valera was interesting. De Valera was at some of those meetings, but was left waiting in the annex because his role, you see, was political, and he was very much so. Again, De Valera's role in the Civil War is very much that he was sidelined. He was now, he'd been a military figure during the War of Independence and all the rest, or during the 1916, and theoretically during the War of Independence. He was head of the Volunteers, but practically he was now a politician. So he was very much sidelined by somebody like Lynch. But De Valera realised at the end of the day you have to get back into the game of politics. That the military struggle wasn't going to be won. But the Civil War lasted. You're into 1923, and it's January and it's February, and they're losing more and more men. Maloney, another son of P.J. Maloney, was caught up in the Glen of Ahlo about, I think, March 1923, with his brother. And he was kind of number two to Lacey. So gradually the leadership was, being gotten rid of one way or another until finally. But Lacey was absolutely, again, there's a lot of people who have a lot of admiration for Lynch, who was leading the Lacey, of course, had been killed in Ahlo again in the spring of 1923. But the Civil War was going to last as long as Lynch said it would, because he wasn't going to surrender. And if you read his correspondence or his dispatches that he was sending out to his support officers, I don't know what kind of fantasy land. It's very difficult. He kept thinking that something would happen. One of the hopes I think he might have had was that the IRA would realise that they needed to do something about the North and the pogroms in the North and so on, and that they would forget their internal differences and that they would join together against. I think maybe he had hope. Or I don't know what else he hoped, because clearly militarily the war was not going to be won. And so until it was, everybody knows the circumstances under which he was killed, by accident as much as anything else. The person who shot at Lynch didn't know that it was Lynch. It was in the mountains and it was in a distance, and a kind of a fluke shot, I suppose, because the shot was fired at a considerable distance, I think. And even then, when the Free State came up on him, some of them were confused. They thought maybe it was De Valera there. They weren't quite clear. And he wasn't killed there. He was brought down to Clonmel, and I think he died in Clonmel. At that stage, then, of course, Frank Aiken was able to take over. And the thing about Aiken was that he was amenable to De Valera, as subsequent history proved, because for decades during De Valera's governments, Aiken was his foreign affairs minister. So he was, willing to to allow the political role, and so the famous kind of lay down your weapons. So that one of the issues about the Civil War, it's not as if there was ever a negotiated peace or anything. It's just that one side stopped fighting and kind of stopped fighting for the moment. And that's 1923, and it's not an accident. One of the things, the centenaries that was marked recently in Tipperary, of course, was the founding of the Garda Síochána. And in Tipperary town, the ceremony to mark that centenary focused on something that isn't 100 years, but is 90 years. In 1931, the superintendent of police in Tipperary was murdered by the IRA. Now that's 10 years after the War of Independence. I think to date even he's the highest ranking Garda to be killed on duty. Again, it's not an accident that it would be Tipperary that it happened. That's 10 years later. So it's not as if the Civil War ended. It's just that one side stopped fighting kind of for the moment. But in some parts of the country, as in Tipperary, South Tipperary, particularly Midwest Tipperary, that whole IRA tradition continued. One of the reasons why that Garda superintendent was murdered in 1931 was he was taking action against IRA drilling, because in some parts of the county, Solohead, for example, where it all began, some young men were still out as their, not even their fathers, their older brothers had been, because it was only 10 years earlier, and the whole thing was kind of going to start as far as they were concerned, because they weren't agreeing with the treaty, and of course they were still in, even though the military, the British military had gone, the RIC had gone, there was self-government. Okay, the king was there and all the rest of it, and you had Irish money, but you also used it indiscriminately with British money. The two had equal, but effectively you had massive amounts of control over policy, but it didn't seem to be enough for some. So I suppose my last word on is to try and understand the division is, are you going to view the thing kind of emotionally, which I think a lot of these people did, and realize, again, there's a phrase which it's not mine, but it's very important, the tyranny of the dead. And the men who died in 1916 and those others who were killed, you couldn't betray them. So it's a very emotional response. And as I say, all of those people died not for home rule, not for dominion status, they all died for the Republic. And so if you went for anything less, you would be betraying. So, as I say, it's a way of viewing the thing, the tyranny of the dead. Whereas on the other side, people who are much more pragmatic, and it's the Collins view. It's not everything we want, but it's a great deal, and we can make more of it. And the making more of it came much more suddenly than people would have expected, because it came in the 30s. Again, through all kinds of outside agencies. The abdication crisis changed the relationship with the Crown. Other dominions wanted more self-control, so they wanted their parliaments to be kind of sovereign and not just to be kowtowing to Westminster. And that all happened, relatively quickly. I mean, nobody was able to foresee the future. But in terms of looking to the future, Collins was right on that one. But on the other one, how many counties? Well, it's still 26. Okay. That's me.
Brilliant.
That's an hour.
Wow. Can I ask you one question?
Yes.
Why was it so strong in your part of Tipperary? What were the underlying?
Yes, that it's an interesting and difficult and obvious question, and one I have clearly looked at. I've mentioned I've done 2 books, one on the War of Independence and one on the Civil War. There is a 3rd book, which I'm just finishing, which I'll have ready for next year, which will look at the land issue. And a lot of it goes back to the land issue. Even if you go back before the famine, the level of violence in Tipperary. There are lots of travellers' accounts, in other words, English people visiting Ireland, early 19th century, particularly early 19th century before the famine, and then going home and writing about, that's quite, and they're wonderful sources. But if they come to Tipperary, I'm talking about the county, if they come to Tipperary County, there's huge amounts of trepidation, because Tipperary is violent. And there's one guy, I think he's Johnson, he's on account, and he explains that he has this apparatus with him, and it's some kind of a bolt. So when you're in an inn for the night, wherever you're staying, you can attach it on a temporary basis to the door. So at least you'll be kind of safe. So Tipperary had a ferocious. It's not an accident that the nickname for Tipperary people, I'm sure you know, like Kilkenny. Well, the nickname for Tipperary people is stone throwers, because that was the weapon that was easiest, and Tipperary were supposed to be erring in their aim. So the level of violence over land. Now, that violence was not related to ownership of land. That comes much later. It's related to access to land, because if you haven't access to land, you can't grow your potatoes. And a lot of the violence isn't against the people over you, it's the people who are particularly quote-unquote strangers, if they're coming in from other places to find work. And so, because again, you have to bear in mind, if you're talking the pre-famine period, there's a massive pressure of population. So the countryside is very different from what it is now in terms of population. So you have that kind of tradition of activism, of violence. And then, of course, you had factions. Again, it doesn't matter the purpose of the factions and whether it was politically motivated or not. I mean, if you go back to the 1760s, when a lot of this kind of collective action to get access to land, it starts in South Tipperary. If you want to get very kind of scientific about it, there was a theory that, which others went out of their way to discredit, that there was a big mixture in Tipperary of Cromwellian blood, that the Cromwellians kind of settled. And that gave a kind of an edge, kind of an anti-authoritarian, because after all the Cromwellians had cut off the head of the king. We never think of the Cromwellians, of course, as the great republicans, which is what they were, but it's not how we want to think about them. On the other hand, you had people on the Irish Catholic side who were horrified by that. And there's a book called The Tipperary Hearth Records, which was written early 1900s. Based on material subsequently destroyed in the Four Courts thing. But interestingly, the preface to that by the guy who compiled the book, who was a Cashel doctor, and by the then Archbishop, because this is a whole list of names, are going out of their way to debunk the whole Cromwellian thing because they can't stand the idea. But whether that is a part of the Tipperary makes up, I don't know. But the land issue is crucial. And if the War of Independence begins just outside Tipperary town, it's not an accident that on the land issue, Ballycohy, which was a famous episode where people resisted an eviction and some men were killed, the plan of campaign and New Tipperary, which is 1889-91, which is an extraordinary thing in Tipperary because you had lots of other, all around the country where people resisted eviction. That's not unusual. But in Tipperary, the dispute wasn't with the landlord. Tipperary tenants were getting on quite well. Their problem with the landlord was he was interfering with the dispute with the landlord in Cork and was backing him financially so that he would stand out against tenants. And so it was a sympathy strike, which was quite extraordinary. And so you had shopkeepers in Tipperary. In many cases, and again, people sometimes don't understand this, what the landlord owned in Tipperary wasn't the houses and the shops and the buildings. It was the ground on which they were built, but it was the landlord's money that had built the houses. So when they walked away, which they did, to build a quote-unquote New Tipperary, their sacrifice was enormous. And that's sometimes not... So anyway, New Tipperary didn't work out. But again, it shows you that there was this intent to resist. So the young men who were involved, one of the things again, if people are interested, as I said, I've done the book on the Civil War, and at the end of that there's a case study of a man called Conway in Tipperary, who was born in 1900. So okay, he's 16 in 1916, and 1990. So his age works out. It's very easy to kind of compute what's going on around him. And I put a map in the book, which I say is kind of the geography of discontent. And so his parents were shopkeepers, so very middle class, an only child. So when he was growing up, just down the road, there was somebody who had come down from Murnane and was working in a shop, but was one of the leaders in the volunteer movement when it started. Just over there was a building where the volunteers, and then had their inaugural meeting in 1914. And then there was where Maloney's had their business, and Maloney's sons would have been a similar age to him. Over there was something called the Tipperary Club, where it was a known meeting place for the IRB. So literally, just across the road from him was a monument to the Manchester Martyrs. Just everywhere he looked. And he wasn't picking it up at home, I don't think, because the parents had a business, and he was an only child, so he was very middle class. He would have been expected to, drapery business, he would have been expected to take over the business from them. But it was going to be very difficult. Literally every move he made, everywhere he turned. And that was just one kind of case study, just to make the point as to why. It is interesting when you look at the Bureau of Military History statements, and this is true, I think, for all over the country. They don't always talk about family background, at the start of the statement. Some of the people making the statement kind of get straight into it. But where they do talk about family background, it's kind of inevitable that you'll say about the father or the grandfather who was out with the Fenians in 1967, which I take with a grain of salt. But you could see why they're saying it. They need to establish that there is. But it is true that in lots, there is a tradition. Even in modern times, people who would be involved in the IRA and so on. It's not. Rose Dugdale would be an example of an exception. But on the whole, You know, I mean, it's a family tradition, and that tradition of resistance, and you know, was very marked in Tipperary.